Just as my mother-in-law went over to the couple to get the Tupperware, my father-in-law suddenly collapsed and fell out of his chair. Everyone turned to look at him, and he was holding his stomach, clearly in a lot of pain. "What's wrong with you?" someone asked. My father-in-law then said something that surprised me. "I just ate a little bit of food from the kitchen. Why is my stomach suddenly upset?" I didn't miss my mother-in-law's comment either. "My name is Elizabeth, and I'm a 20-year-old housewife. My husband Vernon and I got married last year. We're the same age, so we have similar conversations and values. Because of that, we get along really well, and we're just as in love now as we were before we started dating. However, there was one thing that bothered me a little after we got married. When we went to visit my in-laws to give our wedding greetings, I noticed that my mother-in-law was a bit old-fashioned. She said, 'When you get married, you come to your house and live with us, right?' She asked as if it was a given. My husband and I both replied at the same time, 'What?' We had no intention of doing that. So my husband said, 'No, we're planning to live on our own after getting married.' My mother-in-law replied, 'What? But you're the eldest son.' Both my husband and I were troubled by this. Then my father-in-law stepped in and said, 'That's an old-fashioned way of thinking. Do whatever you want, Vernon and Elizabeth.' His words helped calm my mother-in-law down. But there was another issue that made things even more uncomfortable. Neither my husband nor I had planned to have a wedding ceremony. We didn't like anything too fancy and thought it would be better to use the money for travel instead. When I told my in-laws about this, my mother-in-law's face turned pale again. "How can you not have a wedding?" she asked. As I mentioned earlier, my mother-in-law is very traditional, so she was strongly against our idea of skipping the wedding. She was worried about how to explain to the relatives that the eldest son wouldn't have a wedding. In her mind, the eldest son is the most important, so she couldn't accept anything that didn't fit her beliefs. But again, my father-in-law came to our rescue. He said, "None of the relatives care about the wedding. They just see it as a chance to have a nice meal. After a while, they'll forget there wasn't a wedding." My father-in-law said, "If you decide not to have a wedding, that's fine." He was very kind and respected our decision, which saved us from being pressured into following my mother-in-law's old-fashioned ideas. However, my mother-in-law wasn't happy about it. So we got married without a wedding and started living on our own. I became a housewife to support my husband. I feel very happy doing housework and making lunch and dinner for him every day. I think it will be even more enjoyable when we have children someday. About 2 months after our marriage, my parents-in-law asked my husband if he would like to visit them. My husband and I had had some disagreements with my mother-in-law, so we were a little worried. But we hadn't visited their house since getting married, so we decided we should visit them. I was worried that my mother-in-law might try to bully me, but surprisingly, she didn't. In fact, she was very kind. "If you have any questions about being a housewife, you can always ask me," she said. "I have lots of recipes and I'll teach you everything I know." My mother-in-law loves to cook and often invites neighbors over for home parties, which she says are very popular. That day, I had a home-cooked meal prepared by my mother-in-law, and it was delicious. Both my father-in-law and mother-in-law were very kind, and I realized I didn't need to worry as much as I had. My husband felt the same way and thought it would be fine to visit his parents once in a while. About 3 months later, my parents-in-law invited us to a dinner party at their house. Since our last visit had gone so well, we were happy to go. This time, my mother-in-law served food that looked like it came from an expensive restaurant. My husband even complimented her, saying, "You're getting better and better at cooking. You didn't make anything like this when I was a kid. This meal is really delicious. Thank you for preparing so many amazing dishes." My mother-in-law smiled happily when I thanked her and told me to eat a lot. I had a great time. But that night, I had a terrible stomachache. While I was sitting in the bathroom, I started feeling faint and weak. "Hey Elizabeth, are you okay?" I heard my husband's voice, but it faded away. When I woke up, I was in a hospital bed. My husband had called an ambulance, and I was rushed to the hospital. The doctors said they couldn't figure out what was wrong. It wasn't food poisoning or anything like that. I thought maybe there was too much olive oil in the pasta I had for lunch, but I never found out what caused it. After getting an IV drip and some rest, I started feeling better. My husband and I went home and went to bed. I couldn't understand what was going on, but I didn't have any more symptoms after that. However, 2 months later, The same thing happened again. Suddenly, I felt sick. The only thing that was the same as last time was that it happened after eating my mother-in-law's cooking at my in-laws' house. I wondered if my mother-in-law's food was spoiled, but my husband, who ate the same food, was completely fine. Then, a month later, it happened again after we had dinner at my in-laws' house. I invited a friend over for lunch to talk about why this kept happening to me. "Isn't that coming from stress?" she suggested. Her words made me a bit nervous. I thought I was being completely trusting and open-minded, but maybe I was feeling a bit anxious around my mother-in-law without realizing it. After all, I was getting sick every time we visited my in-laws' house, so my husband was worried too. He suggested that we stop visiting my parents-in-law's house for a while. "I don't know the cause, but this always happens when we eat at my parents-in-law's house," he said. He thought it might have something to do with my mother-in-law's cooking. I wondered if that could really be the case. After that, my mother-in-law contacted my husband several times, inviting us to dinner. He always refused, thinking of me. But after a while, we got another invitation that we couldn't refuse. My brother-in-law and his wife were coming to my in-laws' house to give their wedding greetings. I felt a bit down because I had been feeling better by avoiding visits to my in-laws' house. My husband reassured me, saying I didn't have to eat much. So I decided to eat as little as possible. When the day of the party arrived, my mother-in-law was as kind as ever. As long as we talked normally, I didn't feel sick. I started to wonder if maybe there was something wrong with the food after all. A little later, my brother-in-law and his wife arrived, and we had a nice conversation with them. Meanwhile, my mother-in-law was preparing the dishes with great skill, and more food was being laid out on the table. Her home-cooked meals looked as beautiful and delicious as ever. In fact, the food I had eaten before tasted really good, so I still couldn't understand why I was getting sick. As soon as we sat down, my mother-in-law encouraged me to eat. "Elizabeth, you said you liked this dish, didn't you?" she asked. "I made it very delicious today, so please try it," my mother-in-law said. I didn't know what to do. Then my husband stepped in and said Elizabeth isn't feeling well today, so let her eat only what she can when she can. But my mother-in-law responded, "Well then, this small amount should be fine, right?" She placed a small plate with less food in front of me. While I was unsure of what to do, my brother-in-law spoke up, "Elizabeth, if you're not feeling well, you don't have to force yourself. We've already greeted each other, so if you feel sick, don't hesitate to go home and rest." It seemed my husband had told his brother and sister-in-law about everything, and they were trying to help me. My mother-in-law realized she couldn't force me to eat her food, so she said, "Well then, I'll put it in a Tupperware for you to take home." I couldn't help but wonder why she was so eager for me to eat it. I figured that if I took the food home, I didn't have to eat it right away, so I said, "Okay, thank you very much." As my mother-in-law went to get the Tupperware, my father-in-law suddenly collapsed and fell off his chair. We all turned to look at him, and he was holding his stomach, clearly in a lot of pain. "What's wrong with you?" someone asked. He hadn't even touched the food on the table yet. Then my father-in-law said something surprising. "I just ate a little bit of food from the kitchen. Why is my stomach suddenly upset?" I did miss my mother-in-law's comment, "Did you eat some of that?" My husband immediately called an ambulance, and my mother-in-law went with my father-in-law to the hospital. We were all stunned, left at my in-laws' house. But I couldn't stop thinking about what my mother-in-law had said earlier. It seemed that my brother-in-law's wife had noticed something too. We started to wonder if there might be a secret in the kitchen. We decided to check the kitchen where my mother-in-law had been. We found something surprising. We then drove to the hospital where my father-in-law was taken. As soon as we got through the reception desk, we went to his room and heard voices inside. The doctor was asking my mother-in-law if she knew what was wrong with my father-in-law. She said she had no idea. When we entered the room, my mother-in-law looked flustered. "Oh, you guys came all the way here. It's all right. As long as I'm here, it will be fine," she said. But we weren't going to miss this chance. I told her I needed to talk to her and walked up to her, with my husband, my brother-in-law, and his wife following me. "What's going on with you guys?" I asked. My father-in-law's condition seemed to have stabilized and his color looked normal, but they still didn't know the cause. Apparently, he had been conscious for a while after arriving at the hospital and had gone to the bathroom several times. He became dehydrated and lost consciousness completely. I looked my mother-in-law straight in the eye, took something out of my bag, and showed it to her. When she saw it, she got upset. "Do you recognize this?" I asked. She replied, well, what is it?" trying to act like she didn't know. "This is a laxative," I said. I found a lot of powdered laxatives in the kitchen. My mother-in-law fell silent. The doctor then said, "It seems he had these symptoms because he ingested a lot of laxatives. We'll run some tests to be sure. If we find laxative leaves, I'll need to ask him when he ingested them. If he doesn't know, it means someone must have given it to him intentionally, which would be a serious charge." Hearing this, my mother-in-law suddenly panicked. "No, it's not like that," she said. "I didn't try to make him eat that food. It was just negligence." My husband reacted strongly to what my mother-in-law said. "Who were you trying to feed that to?" he asked. My mother-in-law climbed up and said, "You're not going to let this go, so we'll have to call the police to investigate." When my husband said that, my mother-in-law admitted everything. It was all for Elizabeth. I was trying to punish her by feeding her laxatives. "What do you mean, punish me? What did I do to deserve this?" I asked. "Since my son married you, he's become a bad son. You didn't live with us and you didn't have a wedding. You persuaded him to do all of this, so you're my enemy." I told her, "That's just unjustified resentment." "Is that why you've been putting laxatives in my food?" "It wasn't just a little before. That's why I ended up in the emergency room." "How can you say it was just a small amount?" My husband and brother-in-law agreed with me and blamed my mother-in-law. "I can't forgive you for what you did to Elizabeth," my husband said. "I'd be furious too if someone did this to my future wife." In response, my husband and brother-in-law declared that they were disowning my mother-in-law. My mother-in-law started to panic and begged my husband and brother-in-law not to disown her. Then my father-in-law, who had woken up and heard the whole conversation, spoke up. "You've done a terrible thing out of your ego. You should be arrested by the police. I'm so disappointed in you." Even as she pleaded, my father-in-law continued, "You're going to pay Elizabeth $30,000. Of course you'll have to work for it. I won't help you in any way." "No, it's impossible," she protested. "I've been a stay-at-home mom my whole life." "Shut up," he said. "If you don't agree to these terms, I'll divorce you immediately and report you to the police." My mother-in-law had no choice but to agree to work and pay me $30,000. Now she's working hard and paying me little by little. My father-in-law keeps a close eye on her to make sure she doesn't cheat, and all her salary goes towards this payment. She seems very overwhelmed, but I think she deserves it for what she did to me. Meanwhile, my husband and I are living happily. My husband and father-in-law have told me that I don't have to see my mother-in-law again. I feel much better now, knowing that with my husband and father-in-law by my side, I'll be okay no matter what happens. Feeding someone food containing laxatives is indeed a serious crime. It's shocking that a mother-in-law would do something like that so thoughtlessly. One might wonder why such a person was married to her father-in-law. But it seems that her two sons turned out well, so perhaps there was a time when she was different. Whatever the reasons, the punishment seems fair. I hope she works hard to pay the $30,000 to Elizabeth, and I wish Elizabeth and her husband a happy and peaceful life together.